So, to study human systems engineering, you have to know an awful lot about psychology, and this is exactly why we've provided you with a psychology book, and we'll follow that particular curriculum through this course. The idea here is we take those psychological concepts and apply them to issues related to design, and that's what we're going to get started with now. So, let's start by looking at what psychology is. We'll first start by understanding the mind. The mind is the brain and its activities, including thought, emotion, and behavior. And then behavior is any action that we can observe. So that's kind of the idea behind what the mind is. The psychology, as a term, is a combination of two Greek words. Psyche, which means soul. For ancient Greek, soul was really more similar in meaning to spirit or mind. And logos, which is the study of. So that's the same thing as, biology being the study of living things, anthropology being the study of humans, etc. Logos refers to the study of. So literally translated, psychology means the study of the mind. More contemporary definitions often refine this to the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So basically we want to understand how people behave and how the mind enables, or how mental processes enable that behavior to occur. So psychology has a few goals. One, and kind of its simplest, is simply to describe behavior. So describe ways that people behave by observing events and behaviors and examining how they relate to each other. Now, once we're able to describe something, it would really be nice if we could explain it, to explain the causes and so forth, and suggest and test an explanation of that behavior. Now, over time, if we get really good at describing and explaining, hopefully we can actually predict behavior. If we could predict how organisms, in this particular case human beings, will behave in certain situations, then that would enable us to take actions, potentially, to improve those situations. So it would be really nice to predict what events or behaviors may occur and based on how those are related to each other. Now, eventually, if you can do all those three things very well, it would be great if you could control or change behavior. And what we mean by that is sometimes people are sick with a mental illness, for example, and we want to be able to change or control that mental illness. Other times, we're interested in making people avoid things that are not good for them. Driving on the wrong side of a freeway would be an example. If we could control people's behavior so that they didn't do that, that would be a good thing. In fact, Human Factors is heavily involved in that kind of research. So we start with describing, we move on to explaining. Eventually, if we're really good at this, we can predict behavior. And then, if we're really great at it, hopefully we can even change behavior to improve design of all kinds of things. So psychology has its roots really in two areas. One is philosophy, and the other is physical science. So we'll talk about those. Let's start by the philosophy part. Starting with what is the mind? Plato pondered this relationship between mind and body and between knowledge and experience. The idea is he saw the mind as having three parts, and that these three parts had to be in balance, according to Plato. Those three parts were reason, spirit, and appetite. And spirit and appetite were guided by reason. So the idea is you had sort of reason sitting above this and spirit and appetite below. This is similar to what we'll hear about later from Freud as the id, ego, and superego. The other part he was concerned about was what's the relationship between the body and the mind. One way of looking at this is through a philosophical sort of approach called dualism. Dualism is that the mind and the body are actually different and separate things. Our bodies are physical, but our minds are not physical and kind of more mysterious. And all kinds of philosophers adhered to this, from Pythagoras to Socrates to Descartes. In fact, Descartes saw the body as mechanical, but the mind as kind of a non-physical entity. Medieval Christian thinkers wrote about the dualism between body and soul, that these two things were quite different. The other approach to this is called monism. And monism is the notion that the mind and body are not separate, but are really made of the same thing. So adherents to this were Democritus and Aristotle. So you've got sort of two competing ways of looking at this. Is the mind and body different, as the dualist would suggest, or are the mind and body the same, as a monist would suggest? The other component was not just are these the same or different, but is knowledge inborn, or does it come about by experience? Descartes argued that ideas and emotions were inborn. But it was much more common for people to agree with Aristotle, who believed that knowledge is gained solely through experience. So beginning in the 17th century, this idea was really strong in Britain, in their philosophical school called empiricism. So the empiricists thought of the mind as a blank slate at birth that was filled with ideas gained by observing the world, but at the time of birth there was absolutely nothing in the mind, a blank slate. John Locke, who sort of adhered to this approach, said, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, a white paper void of all characters, without any ideas. How does it come to be furnished? To this I answer in one word, from experience." So one group was largely of the opinion that knowledge comes only from experience. This is echoed in psychology that we'll discuss here in a little bit when people talk about nature versus nurture. Nature is this idea of what do we actually, in terms of our personality characteristics, our knowledge, our talents, and things like that, what comes about just through genes, for example, and nurture, what comes about through experience, through how we're raised, etc. Eventually, the philosophical concepts and the physiological understanding of the brain merged into psychology, and that's largely where we are now. Many early psychologists were trained in physiology, as a matter of fact. Often they had their doctorates in physiology and so forth, and sought to apply scientific training to the study of mind. One important distinction between psychology and philosophy, however, especially these days, is psychology adheres to a scientific method, whereas philosophy typically doesn't. So psychologists tend to conduct research and formulate theories based on empirical, that is data, evidence. Not just through sort of doing thought experiments and thinking through things in our heads. We typically collect data just like other scientific areas. So I'm going to hold off here at the philosophical roots, and then I'll talk about a couple different philosophical approaches in the next videos.